Okay, so we have our SQL Server installed. Now we need to look at configuring the instance of our SQL Server that we just installed. Now, I'm going to show you where a lot of configuration options are. I'm not going to take you through all of them. We're not going to do the configurations other than playing around, because a lot of it's going to depend on your environment, how much you expect your databases to grow, how you intend on using them, what kind of workload they're going to carry, what physical hardware they installed on. So I'm going to point out some of the configuration issues that we want to be aware of, but I'm not necessarily going to hit everything. Okay. So let's open up our SQL Server Manager. And we'll see how much of this I do in one video, and we'll see how much I do in another video. In fact, since I'm going to use my SQL Server Management Studio, I'm going to right-click and pin that to my Start menu, or I can also drag that out and just put that on my desktop to make it easier for me to get to. So I just want it there. So let me open up my SQL Management Studio. So this is plain install. I have done nothing with it yet. Now, one of the things I'm going to try to do, let me get connected here, is configure my SQL instance. And I'm using that terminology because remember, we can have multiple SQL installations or instances on the same server. And each one of them on the same physical server or virtual server, and each one of them can have different configurations. So this is an instance configuration. Now, there's a couple of ways I can do this. I'm going to open up here, new query, and I am going to run a stored procedure, which is going to be sp underscore configure. Now, anytime you see something in Microsoft SQL that has that sp underscore, that's typically a stored procedure. So this is something that I can run, gather information. There are also ways I can use stored procedures to run processes or to make changes or whatever. sp configure is a stored procedure for configuring your environment. Now, if all I'm doing is pulling configuration information, I can just click my little execute button and it will run my stored procedure. And here I'm going to see all of my configuration names, the minimum value, the maximum value, what the currently configured value is, and what the run value is. Now, those are separate because you can make a change to one of these configuration values, and that change doesn't actually take effect sometimes until the instance gets restarted. So that's where you will have a difference between the config value and the run value. If you have that, then you need to restart or reconfigure your SQL Server instance. Now, this is a way I can do it. I can use a stored procedure. I can, and just to pull things, all I have to do is sp underscore configure. There's more steps if I'm going to use a stored procedure to do my configuration. But the other possibility is that I can do this using the GUI itself. So if I come up to my instance right here, so this is going to be all of my databases. In fact, I'm going to expand real quick here, just to show you we have some system databases pre-built, all predefined. That came from the installation. So this is going to be my instance, and my instance, remember, it can be a named instance or a default instance. So since this is a default instance, it's just going to say MS SQL Server. So I'm going to right-click and go to Properties. And this lets me access a lot of these configuration options. So when you're learning SQL, being able to configure it through the GUI is very helpful because it lets you see more things. Now, as you progress as a database admin, you might want to use the sp configure because then you can actually write out a configuration script, run it, and configure a server from scratch with just running one script. And that can be really, really convenient if you're doing a lot of deployments or if you want to do a lot of configuration options in a hurry. Okay, so I have my general page here, and on my general page it tells me information. There's nothing I can really change here. It's all grayed out. But on the rest of the pages, I can configure memory usage. What's the maximum or minimum amount of memory this should have? What's the maximum amount this should have? A couple of other options, minimum memory per query, Index creation memory, notice 0 indicates dynamic memory. So I can adjust my memory here. Notice we just talked about the configured value versus the run value. Down here I have the same thing. I can look at my configured values or my run values currently. So my configured value, minimum server memory in megabytes, is 0. Currently I'm running with 16. Okay, so memory settings, processor settings. This allows me to set processor affinity if I want, which means I can have this instance of SQL run on only certain processors, while another instance of SQL runs on other processors. Same reason I might want to divide up the memory. I might want to have a specific amount of memory allocated to different instances, just like I would allocate memory to a virtual machine. Well, not just like, but for a similar idea. So I want to make sure a certain amount of memory, a certain amount of processors is always reserved for one of my SQL instances. That's where I would set this up. Maximum number of workload threads or worker threads, again, configured values versus running values. Security options. Do I want to do Windows authentication? This is something that we set when we did our installation, remember? This will allow me to go back and change it. Do I want to do login auditing? Do I want to have a server proxy account? And then here are some options for me for audit tracking, cross-database ownership, chaining. You get the idea. Connections. Maximum number of concurrent connections, if I want to limit that. Use the query governor to prevent long-running queries. And then here are a bunch of default connection options that I can turn on or off. Do I want to allow remote connections to the server? Yes or no? The default is yes. Otherwise, the only way you can use the database is if you're sitting at the console. And then a remote query timeout. Database settings. The index fill factor, the default backup media retention, recovery intervals. Advanced settings, we have a bunch of things here for containment, file stream, miscellaneous, network, parallelism. Again, a lot of these you are going to adjust based on real world experience. Okay, so once you've done it enough and you're really, really comfortable with SQL and you have an idea of how certain databases are going to be used, then you can make some pretty educated guesses as to how you want to set these things up. In the meantime, if you don't have that, part of it is going to be trial and error. Even if you are an experienced database administrator, sometimes it's trial and error. Let me see how this works, make sure it performs the way I want it to. Oh, it didn't. Well, then maybe I make a couple of changes to my configuration. Okay, so all of this is my per instance configuration. And like we indicated before, you can do this using scripts or you can do this using the GUI. The GUI is going to be easier as you are learning. The scripts will be faster as you become more proficient. Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and stop here. There's some other configurations that we're going to look at in another console, but I think I want to separate that into another video.